Pixels リスト14 Crazy Expensive Saturn Game.
Is it worth it? Let me work it. I put my thing down, flip it and reverse it.
Because I'm worth it.
Hi, I'm Samuel Victor, and you're watching Pixels Lists. You must be very excited.
I'm so excited! I'm so scared! Screech is going to stab someone on Christmas.
This is our show where we try and blatantly court search engine optimization and that pesky YouTube algorithm that all the creators are talking about nowadays by making a show with an exciting title and click-friendly list format. But being Pixels Limited, we don't do anything by half, so we're trying to put our own unique spin on things. Whereas most go for a top 10 or 20, we're choosing a top 14. Why 14? Well, it falls neatly between the two, and most people agree that 7 is a lucky number, so let's double it and make 14. Doubly lucky.
I don't think that's going to work.
Yeah, I'm a hipster, I like to be different.
Though my life is a dickhead, all my friends are dickheads too.
Sorry. We won't always stick to 14s, of course. In some future episodes, we might decide to review every single game in a series, for example, or even every game on a particular system with not very many titles. But for now, it gives a nice basic format to stick to, and I've plenty of ideas for future episodes.
It's a cunning plan, actually. Of course it is.
Before we go any further, I just want to stop and take a second to thank our wonderful Patreons. Richard Carter, aka Fantastic Dizzy, Savage Gaming Show, and all the other wonderful people named on the screen right now. Our ranks are increasing slowly but steadily in every video, and I absolutely love it. You guys are so freaking awesome.
Everything is awesome. Everything is cool when you're part of the team.
Also to update, I recently came back from Paris and can confirm that I did indeed complete my 36-kilometre running challenge. And here's the medals to prove it. This one for the 5k race, the 10k race, a half marathon, 31 kilometres, and 36 kilometres. I'm not going to keep all these on for the whole of this video, that would be very awkward.
Awkward! Awkward!
I did all those races in just one weekend, and to be perfectly honest, I only managed just about to do it all. Over a week later, my body is still aching and recovering.
My body is ready.
But I like to remember that I was trying to do it all to raise awareness for mental health and raise money for charities and good causes.
You do a lot of good work for charity, don't you, Smashy? I certainly do. Cool.
The £100 that I donated personally in my last video was split directly between Mind, which is an awesome mental health charity that Octavius Kitten has raised money for in her live streams.
We are Mind, and we are working together to make a huge difference for now and the future.
And the Happy Hippie Foundation, which is a charity that I've helped Miley Cyrus raise money for in the past through my work with Disney, which helps vulnerable young people, including those with mental health issues, homeless youth, persecuted LGBTQ+ youth, equal rights and education for young women, and more.
If I can kind of be someone that steers it into a positive direction in young people, that's what I want to do.
From a gaming perspective, I've also been doing Let's Play challenges to raise awareness and funds as well, with my Sonic the Hedgehog video going up a couple of weeks ago, and 2 more challenges over the next month or so. Perhaps even a charity livestream if I can get 1,000 subs needed in order to do that on YouTube.
Hey, stop with all the subs. I ain't Jerry.
You're looking good. His name is Jared.
Why don't you have a seat right over there for me?
No.
Subway. Eat fresh.
I don't want to keep harping on about it, but there is still plenty of time to donate to the pot. Links for both our Patreon and the charity appeal are in the description below, so, many thanks to everyone in advance.
Thank you very much.
On the subject of trying to hit 1,000 subscribers, I was hugely shocked, humbled and honoured to be included by the amazing Octavius Kitten in her video this week picking her top 10 favourite YouTubers under 1,000 subscriptions.
I'm excited to see what this channel is going to produce. I can already see that it's great and very nostalgia-y. Nostalgia-y? Is that a word?
This literally made me want to cry because Octavius is one of my favourite YouTubers, full stop, and is one of the main reasons that I started this channel in the first place. I was hugely inspired by watching how quickly the quality of her audio, video and editing evolved just through practice alone, and how she's developed her own completely unique and utterly engaging style.
I've got a whole bunch of games, I've got some very strong wine, let's do this.
We can play together, you be playing one, I don't mind too, as long as it's a good controller and I get to sit with you.
And also, frankly, how Sarah has talked so openly about her struggles with mental health, depression and anxiety, something that I struggle with on a day-to-day basis too. She is a huge inspiration to me, and I joined both Patreon and Twitter specifically to support her. She's the first person I donated to, and the first person that I followed, so to have her list me in her top 10 favourite new channels is just mind-blowing.
Ooh, erotic.
On top of this, DJ Slopes
Hold on a minute, Samuel.
and Guru Larry,
Hello, you.
both of whom run channels that I've watched and loved since the beginning, they both took the time to talk to me online and encourage me to start my own channel. It was something that I should have done at least 15 years ago, to be honest, but I never really had the confidence to put myself out here like this before. So I owe them all a huge debt of gratitude.
Bendy, 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 bendy. Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, you're one in a million. Thank you very much, thank you very, very, very much. Thank you very, 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 very.
Say it with Cadbury's Roses.
The nightmare scenario has landed upon us, lads. Portugal are the winners. Papa Bendy with Papa Bendy. And the young singer there looks quite pleased with himself.
For those who are new here, you might not know, but Larry and Dan both appeared in my first ever video, and Sarah is appearing in the new episode of Pixels.ltd, coming in just a week or two while I finish editing it.
Horace, don't be so rude. I'm on Pixels Limited. I'm a guest.
To have the support of those three guys and other heroes of mine like Kim Justice, Retro Man Cave, Top Hat Gaming Man, Mr. Biffo, and so many others just so early on is just crazy. I can't believe it. But I also want to thank literally everybody who watches these videos, drops a like, comments, follows us on Twitter, Pixels_Limited, shares our videos, and just anything else to help the channel grow. It is honestly so appreciated.
I appreciate you. You loyal.
Anyway, as soon as that Octavius Kitten video went live, of course I got a massive increase in subscribers overnight. So to the hundreds of new people here, welcome, truly. You have stumbled across our funny little retro gaming channel and corner of the internet. Lucky you. Yeah, we do that a lot here.
This is how we do it. Hammer time.
Anyway, onto the list. One of my absolute favourite consoles to collect for is Sega's Saturn. Outside its home country of Japan, the poor old Saturn came a distant third behind Sony's PlayStation and Nintendo's N64. But those who owned the system always knew that behind the weak multiplats and dodgy ports, some of the very best exclusive gaming experiences of that generation were on Sega's second stab at 32-bit greatness. Once you factor in imports, with the all-important Japanese market providing a huge array of incredible exclusives, the Saturn turns out not only to be a great competitor to the other consoles of its generation, but truly one of the greatest consoles of all time.
Of all time. All time.
Stop it. Get some help.
Because the system is such a huge hit with collectors, it has a reputation for being a little on the pricey side for newcomers, but I'd argue that, as with all consoles, there are super valuable rare games, but also amazing titles that you can pick up for peanuts. This episode, though, I will be looking at 14 of the more expensive games to pick up, and asking if they're truly worth spending your money on, or if they're just overpriced rubbish. This is not intended to be a definitive list of the 14 most expensive. Heck, I've already got a part 2 planned for the future with 14 more pricey titles, but rather this list has been put together to hopefully be as interesting as possible, with a variety of different styles and genres, starting with some of the more affordable titles and then topping out with the more ridiculously priced games. I'll mostly be concentrating on PAL European games, as these are the ones that I grew up with and therefore the ones I prefer to collect. However, of course, if there is an essential title that only came out in America or in Japan, these may very well appear on the lists as well. This isn't intended to be flexing or showing off my collection, as I'm far from a price snob. In fact, my very next list of 14 for the Saturn will be of 14 of the cheapest games available, and that list contains some of my very favourite games for the system. Rather, the point of this list is to determine whether the games are worth their high price tags, or if you'd be better off spending your money elsewhere. So, how are we going to determine this? Well, I'm glad you asked.
I'm glad you asked that because I wanted to take this time to explain my evil plan.
I will be rating each game out of 10 points, with 10 being an essential purchase and 0 being a complete mess, of course.
Smithies, are they booing me?
No, they're saying boo earns, boo earns.
The first 5 points will be determined simply by the game itself. How fun is it to play overall, and what would I rate it out of 5 based on its own merits? 3 points would be average, and above and below that work exactly how you'd expect.
Oh.
Yeah, oh. The second set of 5 points, making up our mark out of 10, is where it becomes more interesting for the purpose of this list, and will come with the following system. Firstly, is it a good addition to the console's library? I.e., if you're collecting specifically for that system, how essential is the game? If it's one of the best games on the console, then I'll award 2 points in total. If it's really good, but similar or better games are available on the same format, it gets 1 point. And if it's rare or valuable, but actually a bit of a stinker, it'll get 0 points for this section.
Nil point, nil point, nil point, nil point, nil points, nicked points, no points. It's not even real French. It's false pigeon French.
Next up, is the game exclusive to the console, or is it available on another system? If it is available on another system, how do these ports compare in both quality and price? If the game is still the definitive version, I'll award 1 point towards the total.
People say we're two peas in a pod, and that we look like each other. There's something that they forgot. I am the cute one.
He's Tiny Lister.
If you're better off elsewhere, no points here. Then, is the game cheaper in another region or variant? For example, would a Japanese version be cheaper than a European or American release? And if so, is the language barrier an issue for this particular game? If you absolutely have to buy this particular version, then it gets 1 point towards the total. And lastly, are there better sequels, other games in the series, or similar games available elsewhere for cheaper? If the game is truly unique, or the best example of its series, then it gets 1 point towards the total. If not, no extra point.
Are you saying boo or boo earns?
I was saying boo earns.
Right, with all that in mind, let's get started.
No. Yes. I don't know. It's just all happening so fast.
14.
Number 14 is Marvel Superheroes. The Saturn is well known for being a 2D powerhouse, and the Capcom fighters are an incredible way to show off the hardware. Marvel Superheroes is a one-on-one fighter similar to Street Fighter II, but of course using Marvel characters, and a pseudo-sequel to X-Men Children of the Atom. This is the PAL release, which is pretty rare, and in good, complete condition, will set you back between £25 and £50. So, judging by itself, is it a good game? Absolutely, yes it is. I love Capcom 2D fighters, and this is no exception. It's great fun. Incredible graphics, perfect controls, brilliant fun in both single and two players. It's a bit hectic with a lot going on screen at once, and many would argue it's not as balanced or technical as other 2D fighters, and the single player mode is fairly bare bones, but it's huge amounts of fun as a game in its own right, so I'm giving it 4 out of a maximum 5. However, Capcom released a whole ton of one-on-one fighters on the Saturn, as did SNK, Midway and others, not to mention the slew of excellent 3D fighters on the console. There are also many Marvel-themed games on the system as well. It's arguable that many of the other fighting games on the Saturn surpass this one, so it's a really good game, but unless you want to collect every Capcom fighting game on the system, it's not exactly essential to have it in your library. So I'm going to give it 1 out of 2 points for this category. This game was released on the original PlayStation as well as the Saturn. However, as is common due to differences between the system's hardware, the Saturn version is noticeably better, with practically no loading times and all the frames of animation and background details from the arcade. It's a pretty perfect port. The PlayStation version is around the same price, so you are much better off buying the Saturn version. Also, due to licensing restrictions, it's highly unlikely that this game will ever be re-released in a modern compilation, so if you want the game, this is the way to play it. 1 extra point added. This PAL version is pretty uncommon. The game was also released in America, but is seemingly even more rare, with prices around the $90 mark. However, the game was more widely released in Japan and can be picked up for £15 to £20. As it's a one-on-one fighter, there's very little text and there's no real language barrier, so in all honesty, if you want to pick up this game, you can save yourself a lot of money by buying the Japanese version. No extra point here. As I already mentioned, Capcom have released many one-on-one fighters on the Saturn. As a technical fighter, it isn't as pure as an experience as something like, say, Street Fighter Alpha 2, or as unique as something like Night Warriors. Of course, it's super cool to fight as the Marvel characters, but personally, I prefer the later Marvel crossover games like Marvel Superheroes vs. Street Fighter, also available on the Saturn, or Marvel vs. Capcom on the Dreamcast. So, no extra point, unfortunately. So, Marvel Superheroes is an excellent fighting game in its own right, and easily worth 4 out of 5 as a standalone game. I personally love nearly all of the Capcom fighting games, and I want to own them all, so for me, it is an essential purchase. But for those just looking for a great 2D fighter, when considering if it's worth spending the extra cash the PAL version commands nowadays, sadly it's only reached 2 out of the extra 5 points, as other Capcom fighting games are arguably better games and are far cheaper to pick up as well. And if you really want this exact game, the Japanese version will be far better value for money. So, in total, we have a final score of 6 out of 10. I know that'll sound harsh to many, but remember, this isn't a review score as such, it's more a guide as to whether an increasingly expensive game is actually worth your money, or whether you're better off buying elsewhere.
13.
Number 13 is this limited edition cardboard box version of Virtua Fighter Remix. When the Saturn first launched, it was somewhat of a rush job, partly to try and beat Sony's PlayStation to shop shelves and gain market advantage, and partly because Sega's stopgap console add-on, the 32X, had died a far quicker death than anyone really expected it to.
New Genesis 32X. Everything else is cold and stiff.
That's a tragedy in itself, but that's a story for another video. The upshot of rushing to market meant that a lot of the launch titles were quite rushed and appeared unfinished, and far more jerky and glitchy than the system was actually capable of. Case in point, Daytona USA, and Virtua Fighter.
What the hell was that?
Perhaps because of this, the Saturn failed to sell very well in the first few months of release, so Sega vastly dropped the price of the system pretty quickly, I remember the UK shops dropping it from £400 to just £300 after only a few months of release. As a way to thank early adopters of the system and to appease anger at having been charged so much more money than everyone else, in most territories Sega sent money-off software vouchers to all registered Saturn owners and a free copy of Virtua Fighter Remix, a vastly improved version of the game. Because of this, it's one of the most common games on the system. However, this version is pretty rare because it's a retail version for later adopters who wanted to buy it. It comes in this unique cardboard packaging with a gatefold that opens to reveal some artwork and the keys for all the special moves for each character and how to unlock the hidden fighter, Giral. Inside the box, the actual game comes in this double CD case, which is similar to how the European Mega CD games were packaged. Inside the case are a manual and 2 CDs, one with the game itself, and a bonus disc which plays like a photo CD and contains loads of artwork, images, and portraits of the characters. Finding this double jewel case with the bonus disc inside it is fairly uncommon in itself, but having the full package with the cardboard box is what really adds the value. In today's prices, these fetch between £25 and £50, and the value seems to be rising. So, is it a good game? Yes, of course. Everyone knows that Sega were world-renowned at the time for their arcade games, and every Virtua Fighter game is excellent. The first game set the standard for 3D fighting games and basically started one of the most popular genres of the 90s. Virtua Fighter is a more realistic and technical fighting game than something like Street Fighter or even Tekken. You won't find any projectile fireballs or magic attacks here, just fluid fighting based on real-life martial arts moves and techniques. Okay, so the jumping physics feel a little bit like you're on the moon, and it can be frustrating to newcomers, as you can't really win just by button mashing. But if you put the time in to learn the game, the Virtua Fighter series is one of the most rewarding for serious players. This remix version fixes a lot of the issues of the original Saturn port, removing a lot of the glitching, adding to the poly count, smoothing the frame rate, even adding texture mapping to somewhat improve the look of the original flat shaded game, bringing the visuals more up to par with the first Tekken game on PlayStation and arcade hardware. Whilst this game supersedes the arcade game in many ways, there was actually a limited arcade run of this remix in the arcades, which is identical to the Saturn version, as it's based on the STV hardware, rather than Sega's Model 1 board, so you could argue that this game is quite literally arcade perfect. As the first real 3D fighting game, it's perhaps not the most honed of games, and many back then argued that the 2D fighting games at the time were actually better to play, and I tend to agree, though it was clear that 3D fighters would soon evolve beyond their sprite-based contemporaries. As a standalone game in its own rights, it's not perfect, but it is great fun, and I can happily award this a 4 out of 5. Now, as for whether it's a good addition to the Saturn's library, that's not quite so cut and dry. To be honest, the Saturn had a ton of 3D fighting games, many of which completely eclipsed this one. Just from Sega alone, there's Fighting Vipers, Last Bronx, the 3 other Virtua Fighter games, and Fighters Megamix. On import, we have probably the best version of the original Dead or Alive. There's even 2 Toshinden games, a series mostly known as a PlayStation franchise, but with enhanced remixes on Saturn. And of course, the system hosts a huge library of top-quality 2D fighters, as we've already mentioned. Whilst it does improve on the first Virtua Fighter, the original's flat-shaded polygons were kind of charming in a retro kind of way, and these texture map graphics just make it seem like an inferior version of Virtua Fighter 2. It might be harsh, but I don't think I can award any bonus points here. Of course, the Virtua Fighter series was a Sega console exclusive until they stopped making hardware, but there was an enhanced PC port of this released for Windows 95 that supported dedicated 3D cards, and if you really want to try the remix version of the game, that's probably the way to go, as it will have a higher resolution and frame rate, so no point awarded here. The game is much, much cheaper if you just want the free giveaway disc and you don't really care about the fancy packaging, so again, no extra point. Of course, there are many sequels to this game. Arguably, Virtua Fighter 2 on the Saturn itself outclasses Remix in every possible way, and is possibly my favourite game in the series overall. Even Virtua Fighter Kids on the Saturn has a better game engine, and that's not to mention games like Virtua Fighter 3 TB on Dreamcast, and various iterations of Virtua Fighter 4 on PS2, or 5 on 360 and PS3, so sadly, no extra point. So in summary, a decent 4 out of 5 points for the game on its own. It really is a fun time, but when you take into account the high price, the better fighting games available on the system, including the mighty Virtua Fighter 2, which you can pick up for, £2-3? There's literally no way that I can justify this high price tag, unless you are a collector who wants the cool packaging on your shelf. A paltry 4 out of 10 here. Really sorry, guys.
Is it too late now to say
12.
Die Hard Arcade. This guy on the front doesn't look anything like Bruce Willis. He actually looks like a buff version of Vitalik Buterin, the inventor of Ethereum. Clearly Sega got the license for the movie's name, but not for Bruce Willis's likeness.
Yippee-ki-yay, motherfucker.
In Japan, it's not even called Die Hard Arcade, it's Dynamite Decker. As you'd expect from a Sega arcade port at the time, this game is a Sega Saturn exclusive, and it's quite sought after. Complete PAL copies go for between £30 and £55. So, just judging the game on its own merits, yeah, this is a stone cold classic. An absolutely excellent game in every way, totally worth your time. It's a scrolling beat-em-up in the vein of Streets of Rage or Final Fight, but in glorious 32-bit, chunky, polygonal 3D graphics. The weapon pickups are amazing, the interactivity with the backgrounds are great, the two-player co-op is sublime. There are also these neat QuickTime events for bonuses between levels, and I'm pretty sure this was the first game to introduce the QTE, unless you count Laserdisc FMV games. Don't hold that against it though, this really is a really great game with a ton of replay value. I have absolutely no qualms giving it a perfect 5 out of 5. As an addition to the Saturn library, this really was quite valuable. The only proper 3D iteration of the popular scrolling beat-em-up genre on the console, and an actually decent movie license, and a system exclusive to boot, so the full 2 out of 2 bonus points here. Nice one. Of course this game isn't available on other systems, the only other way to play this was in the arcades. And incidentally, this is a pixel-perfect arcade translation, as the original cabinet was a Sega Titan Video, or STV title, similar to the arcade version of Virtua Fighter Remix I mentioned. An STV is essentially a Saturn board which took cartridges, similar to the Neo Geo MVS or Capcom CPS2. The only difference between this and the arcade is that in order to get more credits to play the game, instead of inserting money, you play this bonus game to earn extra credits for the main game. The bonus game is a perfect arcade port of Sega's 1979 arcade game Deep Scan, which is a really nice, fun touch, and as far as I know, it's the only official way to play this game too. So, 2 full perfect arcade ports, and exclusive for the system, that's a well-deserved bonus point right there. The American version of this game is just as expensive, if not a little bit more. However, if you buy the Japanese version of the game, you will save yourself quite a lot of money. Just search eBay for Dynamite Decker, D-E-K-A, and you'll see plenty of copies for £5 to £10. The language barrier really doesn't apply here, the cutscenes are short and non-essential to gameplay, so it's hard to recommend spending the extra money if you have a system that can play Japanese games. There's also apparently a PlayStation 2 re-release on Japanese import as well, so no extra point for this specific version. There is another Die Hard game on the Saturn, Die Hard Trilogy, but that game is completely unrelated to this one. It's a decent game, but it's a port of the PlayStation game, and the PlayStation version is much better, so get it on that system if you're going to get it. As for other games which actually supersede this one, it did get an official sequel on the Dreamcast, Dynamite Cop 2, which is really fun in its own right, and I really do recommend it, but I still slightly prefer this Saturn game. The only other real 3D takes on the scrolling beat-em-up that I know of that can compete directly with this are on the original PlayStation. Fighting Force, which originally started life as Streets of Rage 4 before it lost that license, and Gekido Urban Fighters, which I only recently learnt about from good friend of Pixels.ltd, the Savage Gaming Show. Both these games are featured in Savage's video on the PlayStation Mini, link up here. Or is that here? I'm not sure. Both Fighting Force and Gekido are really fun games, but there is something special about Sega's arcade output from this period, so I've got to give the win to Die Hard Arcade, so 1 bonus point awarded here. In summary then, Now we're really starting to get somewhere. 5 out of 5 for the game on its own, and another 4 bonus points for uniqueness and value, giving us 9 out of 10 for Die Hard Arcade. Highly, highly recommended. Just pick up the cheaper Japanese version if you aren't strictly a PAL collector and you don't care about it saying Die Hard on the box.
11.
I'm sure that most of you will know that the House of the Dead is a long-running series of Sega arcade games, almost all of which are light gun shooters. Sega's other arcade light gun games at the time, Virtua Cop 1 and 2, are some of the most common Saturn games, but this port came late in the system's release and is one of the last games ever released, so it's getting pretty rare. It'll set you back between £30 and £60. So, is it a good game? Well, that's a tough call. The arcade game is an absolute classic, and I would award that one 5 out of 5 with no question, but sadly, the Saturn one isn't the best port. Whilst Saturn's Virtua Cop conversions were both excellent and felt nearly arcade perfect, this one is clearly straining the system's hardware a little and has some very low-res textures, glitchy graphics, and a very wavering frame rate. The Virtua Gun is excellent as always, and if you still have a CRT television to make it work, you will have a fun time, but if you're on a modern TV and you're stuck with controlling a sluggish cursor with the D-pad, it's not much fun. Overall, I personally think it's really cool to see the game running on Saturn hardware at all, but it is hard to wholeheartedly recommend it because of the limitations of the port, so I give it a 3 out of 5. As an addition to the Saturn library, I think it's good to get another high-profile arcade port, and horror games are always welcome, as is another game to make use of the Virtua Gun controller, so it's not exactly a good showcase for the system, and it arrived too late in the console's life to make any real impact, so I'll give it 1 out of a possible 2 points for this category. Again, as a Sega arcade game of the 90s, it was a console exclusive. It was ported to the PC, but in all honesty, clicking bad guys with a mouse is never going to be as much fun as shooting with a gun, so the Saturn version is still the definitive version, even if it's not great. 1 bonus point semi-grudgingly awarded. The American version of this game is horrendously expensive, around $200 or even more, making this PAL version look like a bargain in comparison, but again, the Japanese version can be found for much, much cheaper, just £15 to £20, so a light game being hardly text-heavy, I'd say go for that version. No bonus here. As for sequels, the Dreamcast port of House of the Dead 2 is infinitely better than this one. As far as I can tell, it's an arcade-perfect port. Definitely go for that over this if you own the Dreamcast. For the Saturn itself, Virtua Cop 1 and 2 are far better buys, and on the PlayStation, Time Crisis, Point Blank or Die Hard Trilogy are all better light gun games, so no extra point. So a 5 out of 5 arcade game sadly becomes a 3 out of 5 due to a poor port. 2 bonus points make it a 5 out of 10 in total. If you love light gun games and have already played the other titles I mentioned, there's definitely fun to be had here, but overall it's not really worth the cash, I'm afraid.
I'm just wondering, what's the point? Would it make any difference at all if I never existed?
10.
The Shining games are an interesting series of RPGs for Sega's consoles, and the Saturn alone has Shining Wisdom, Shining Force 3, and this game, Shining the Holy Ark. This game is fairly uncommon, commanding between £55 and £80. Giving a mark out of 5 for an RPG is very subjective, as it depends how much you personally engage with the story and the characters. The Shining series are pretty varied, but if you are familiar with the Shining series at all, this is a dungeon crawler and feels the most similar to the Mega Drive's Shining in the Darkness. It's a pretty long game, so it'll give you plenty of hours play, and the story is engaging, even if some of the translation is a little bit iffy, and some of the characters seem generic, but the battles in this game are turn-based, but from a first-person perspective, which is a really interesting twist, and I had a lot of fun with this game back in the day, but I've never really felt the need to replay it, so I'll give it 4 out of 5. As an addition to the Saturn library, any Japanese RPG translated into English is always going to be welcome, as there weren't too many of them, and these titles can offer far more hours of play than the typical short arcade experiences on the system. However, it's arguable that dungeon crawler titles are not quite as well loved as strategy RPGs like Shining Force 3 or action role players like Shining Wisdom. So 1 out of 2 bonus points added here. As a Sega series, this is a system exclusive, so a quick and easy 1 point bonus added here. The American version of this game commands the same kind of prices of the European version, whilst the Japanese version is much cheaper, but it is of course in Japanese and is a very text and dialogue heavy title, so I can't really recommend it. PAL version does win out in this case, 1 bonus point. There are a ton of Shining games on most Sega systems, and 2 other Shining games on the Saturn alone. Personally, I vastly prefer Shining Force 3 over this one. So, of course, there are also plenty of other great RPGs on the system that I'd recommend before this one as well, so it is a good game, but not essential, so no bonus here. In summary then, 4 out of 5 for the game on its own merits, and 3 bonus points for the is it worth it factor. 7 out of 10. Not bad at all, but not quite essential considering the quite steep price tag.
9.
Ah, King of Fighters, SNK's main rival to Capcom's Street Fighter II, and an excellent series in its own right. The Neo Geo is somewhat of a legendary system, being hugely expensive and therefore out of most people's reach, both at the time and nowadays, and many people drooled over its arcade-perfect conversions of SNK's stellar arcade titles, like King of Fighters. This game was striving really hard to be arcade-perfect on the Saturn too, and therefore required this cool little cartridge to add extra RAM to expand the system's capabilities. The game and the RAM cartridge come together in a cardboard box, and finding the box intact is getting harder and harder nowadays. Be prepared to pay between £75 and £90 for this bad boy. As a one-on-one fighter in its own right, this is a great game that you will have a really good time with. The conversion is perfect and you can really see where they use that extra RAM. These sprite graphics are outstanding with so many frames of animation. On its own merits, this is easily a 5 out of 5 game, but is it a good game addition to the Saturn library? And honestly, that is a tougher question. SNK fighting games were never as popular in the West as Capcom's efforts, and the Mortal Kombat games, and even titles like Primal Rage, probably shifted more systems than King of Fighters, for better or worse.
For better or worse.
It probably doesn't help having that big 95 in the title, because most people knew there was at least one new King of Fighters iteration per year, so it may have felt like it would be superseded very quickly, and that might have put people off buying it. It's a great game, no doubt, but it probably didn't actually help the system library too much, so 1 out of 2 bonus points here. At the time, the Saturn port was the definitive version, unless you owned Neo Geo AES itself. But nowadays, SNK release Neo Geo compilations like all the time, as well as the excellent Hamster arcade re-releases for modern consoles. There is literally no reason to own this version of the game unless you are specifically a Saturn collector. For some reason, the game was never even released in America. Perhaps Sega of America figured it wouldn't sell enough copies to justify the cost of making these RAM cartridges. However, in Japan, the game and the cartridge are cheap as chips. Literally. You can pick up the game and the RAM cart boxed together for about £2.50. So, if you want to own the game, that's the way forward. No language barrier here, no bonus point for the PAL version. Are there any sequels? Do we really even need to ask? There are a ton of different versions of King of Fighters. I think I've counted 18 main game iterations over the years, plus there's plenty of revisions. 95 is a good one, but it's nowhere near the best. Most people would agree that 98 is probably the best of the older titles, or just go for one of the latest versions. It's not even the best SNK fighter, let alone considering competition from other 2D fighting games from Capcom and the like, so can't really award any bonus points here either, I'm afraid. So, 5 out of 5 for the game on its own merit, but once you consider the other ports of the same game, plus sequels and rival games, everything just falls apart. Just 1 bonus point added, giving us 6 out of 10 total.
What is my purpose?
You pass butter.
Oh my god.
Really interesting way of rating these games on the essential purchase scale, giving interesting results like this. I'm actually having a lot of fun with this, I hope you guys are too.
Fun, think about fun. You know what it is. 8.
The Shinobi series needs no introduction. The Mega Drive games are the stuff of legend, and this 32-bit iteration, Shinobi X, was highly anticipated at the time. Due to the Saturn faring less well than its 16-bit predecessor, this sequel is a lot rarer than the Mega Drive games, commanding £65 to £100. For those who've never played a Shinobi game, it is a legendary series of Sega games which kind of feel like a cross between a platform game and a run-and-gun title, where you control a ninja with cool weapons and power-ups and really unique level and enemy variety. This 32-bit game is not the most refined in the series, and some of the graphical touches haven't quite aged as well, but it's still very playable, a solid 4 out of 5 then. As a game to add value to the Saturn's library, however, this is a no-brainer. For some reason, Sega never really released proper Saturn sequels to some of their biggest Mega Drive franchises. Where was Sonic? Where was Streets of Rage? Why release the silly Golden Axe the Duel spin-off when what we really wanted was a port of the arcade version of Revenge of Death Adder? It was almost a relief to see Shinobi appear on the Saturn, and to many this may have been a system seller, so 2 full bonus points here. This was a system exclusive at the time, and I've never seen it ported to another system even nowadays, so if you want to play it, then you need it on Saturn. 1 bonus point. In America, the game is called Shinobi Legions, and it costs around about the same. The Japanese version is called Shin Shinobi Den and is about half the price at £30 to £50, so there's no real language barrier, so I can't recommend the more expensive PAL version, so no bonus point awarded there. The Shinobi games are fairly unique, so I wouldn't recommend other series of games against them, but within its own series, it's hard to recommend Shinobi X. It's a really fun little game, but the holy trinity of Revenge of Shinobi, Shadow Dancer, and Shinobi 3 on Mega Drive all outclass this game in pretty much every way. Only play this game if you've got bored of all 3 Mega Drive classics, and to be honest, I've never got bored of them, so I can't really award a bonus point here. Shinobi X is a tough game to rate. As a standalone game, I stick by my 4 out of 5, but there are so many other games in the series which far outclass it, so the 3 bonus points give it a 7 out of 10 rating. It's good, but not essential, especially considering the high price for the Western versions.
7.
To this day, I'll never understand why we didn't get a proper Sonic game on Saturn. I mean, I know the story of the cancelled Sonic X3, and we did get the stopgaps of Sonic Jam, Sonic R, and the enhanced port of Sonic 3D, but honestly, Sega should have prioritised a AAA perfect Sonic game for the system. Mario 64 style. But the majority of people who bought a Mega Drive bought it to play Sonic. The majority of people who bought a NES, SNES, and even N64 at launch at least, did it to play Mario, but Sonic just sat in development hell for years, with Extreme getting cancelled and restarted so many times it eventually became irrelevant and was cancelled. However, Sonic Team didn't neglect the Saturn console, far from it. They just made completely new, non-Sonic games that would really show off the system's 3D capabilities. Firstly, the incredible Nights into Dreams, one of my favourite games of all time, and secondly with Burning Ranges. Again, one of the last games released on the system. It's pretty tough to find this nowadays. This is where we're starting to get into silly money territory. Burning Ranges will set you back from £70 to a whopping £130. This is an absolutely unique game. Nothing is quite like it. It's a third-person action title where you play as futuristic firefighters in mechanised suits. It really is unique. It also makes brilliant use of the Saturn's 3D controller with analog stick, if you have one, and if you don't, please get one right now. It's one of the best ever controllers and pretty much essential for Nights into Dreams. As for Burning Ranges, is it fun to play? Heck yeah it is. It's slick, it's smooth, visually impressive with real-time lighting and transparencies that many thought were impossible on the system, and the soundtrack is incredible. This is easily a 5 out of 5 game for me. This really is a great title for the Saturn and really shows off what the system can do with programmers who properly understand its complex architecture. It's just a shame this arrived so late in the system's life, when, in the West at least, the PlayStation and N64 had almost killed it off completely. This game should have been a system seller, no question. The full 2 bonus points awarded here. This game is a system exclusive, and it never released on any other platform, which is a crying shame, but that's great news for the Saturn, so another bonus point. The American version of this game is hideously expensive, often hitting $350 or more. The Japanese one is, again, much cheaper at around £20 to £30. But there is a lot of dialogue in the game, so I'd recommend the English version, making the PAL version the one to get. 1 bonus point awarded. There are no sequels, and really no other game like this one, so again, another easy bonus point to add. So there we go, our first game to get 5 out of 5 on its own, and 5 out of 5 for a recommendation, a perfect 10 out of 10 score. It's expensive, but honestly, it's totally worth it.
6.
Now, here's an interesting one. Mortal Kombat Trilogy. Most people assume that this would be a common and inexpensive game due to how popular and mass market the Mortal Kombat series is, but on the Saturn, it's actually pretty rare. You can easily pay £100 to £150 for this sucker. Yikes. I'm a huge fan of the Mortal Kombat series, as you can tell by my t-shirt, especially the first 2 games. I'll be doing a ton of content on those titles in future videos. The third game was a bit of a mixed bag for me, as I loved some of the new fighters, finishing move additions, and the real-world based multi-layered backdrops, but I didn't really like the changes they made to Scorpion and Sub-Zero, my previous 2 favourite fighters, and the fact they even removed some characters from the previous games kinda sucked. Mortal Kombat Trilogy, then, is somewhat of the perfect game for me, being that it combines pretty much all the backdrops, fighters, and variations from all 3 games. Yes, both versions of Sub-Zero and Scorpion are here. Even though Trilogy itself never made it into arcades, this port is great and it feels like an arcade-perfect port of the first 3 games, but all combined together. Sure, some will argue it's less focused and less balanced as a result, but for me the Mortal Kombat series was never really about technical fighting like Street Fighter was. It was more for the out-and-out silly, fun, and often brutal gameplay. This is therefore probably my favourite Mortal Kombat game of all time, and I will happily give it 5 out of 5. So is it a good addition to the Saturn library? Yes, but with some caveats. The Mortal Kombat series was a huge seller, very popular and very worth playing. The Saturn version of Mortal Kombat 2 was tragically bad due to being a very rushed port, and although the arcade-perfect Ultimate Mortal Kombat 3 was excellent, Trilogy tops it. The only thing going against this are the fact that it was released a little bit later than the PlayStation version, and by this point 3D fighters were far more popular, with some finding 2D fighters a bit old hat. Also, by the time of its eventual release, there was already a huge amount of 2D fighters available for the system, including 2 Mortal Kombat games, which fans of the series might have already bought, so let's give this 1 out of 2 possible bonus points here. Trilogy was available on the PlayStation, and it's an excellent game, arguably as good as the Saturn version. Whilst the more graphically taxing Capcom fighters are easily better on the Saturn than the PlayStation, these 2 versions are far more closely matched. If anything, the PlayStation version has slightly improved graphics, with transparency effects instead of dithering, and strangely, the Saturn lost a few minor voice samples somewhere in the port as well. I've heard people argue that the Saturn version is slightly more responsive and has slightly faster loading times, but it really is a very close count thing. They're nearly identical in all honesty, with the PlayStation version being slightly more fuller featured and also far cheaper to pick up. There's a fairly rare DOS version of the game, which is also excellent if you can find it. Good Old Games have already brought back the DOS ports of Mortal Kombat 1 through 3, so hopefully they will eventually port this trilogy too. If they do, that may be the one to get. The Nintendo 64 version is by far the worst of the main 3 console ports due to the limited space on the cartridge format, meaning that the game is very, very cut down, as is the Game Boy Advance port. Also, the N64 was pretty much designed from the ground up to play cutting-edge 3D games, but the way it handles 2D sprites is rather janky, meaning that whilst it's still fun and playable, it really is one to avoid if you have access to any other main version of the game. There was a game of the same name on both Tiger's R-Zone and Gamecom, but if you know anything about either of those systems, you'll know to pretty much avoid any game ported to them, because they're always terrible, and they really just share the name only, so yeah. This game is available on many systems, and the Saturn version is probably on equal footing with the PlayStation and PC versions, but both of those games can be found a lot cheaper, so I can't award a point here. There's no cheap Japanese alternative here, as the Mortal Kombat series never really took off in the East. Caters far better for a Western audience. The American version of the game is really expensive too, but a little bit cheaper than the PAL version, being available for $80 to $100. So if you have a system capable of playing NTSC games, I'd go for the American one over the European one. No bonus point here. Of course, there are plenty of other Mortal Kombat games, but Trilogy is arguably the best, if you like the old-style arcade over the new 3D entries. There are, of course, many other 2D fighting games which are technically better than this on every level, but Mortal Kombat is a unique series which feels and plays far different to, say, Street Fighter or King of Fighters, so perhaps controversially, I'm going to give the bonus point here. So, again, a 5 out of 5 game, but only 2 bonus points, giving a 7 out of 10 overall. If you like old-school Mortal Kombat, then Trilogy is the game to play, but if you can find the PlayStation or DOS versions for cheaper, or if you can import an American version, you will save yourself a chunk of cash over this overpriced gem.
5.
I'm sure Street Fighter needs no introduction. Street Fighter 2 is the granddaddy of one-on-one fighting games, and still arguably the best, most competitive fighter to this day. Street Fighter 2 is a game that I'll be covering in great detail in future videos, but for now we're looking at this collection here. You may be surprised to hear that this doesn't even include the original Street Fighter 2, Championship Edition or Turbo. These were instead included on a Japanese exclusive Capcom Generations release. Instead, this collection jumps straight into the CPS2 arcade games, so Super Street Fighter 2, the improved Super Street Fighter 2 Turbo, and strangely skips the original Alpha and Alpha 2 to include Alpha 2 Gold, otherwise known as Alpha 2 Dash, depending on your region. This game is extremely rare in Europe, commanding a whopping £140 to £180. What? I think this is a strange selection of 3 games of a so-called collection. If you had to pick just 3 games, I would have swapped Super Street Fighter for the original Street Fighter 2, or Turbo maybe. With Super Turbo included, I see no reason at all to ever even boot up the original Super. They're just too similar, but Turbo is better. However, Super Street Fighter 2 Turbo included here is the last proper retro arcade iteration of Street Fighter 2, and easily the best there is. Super Turbo by itself is no question a 5 out of 5 game, and this is a perfect arcade port. The Street Fighter Alpha series of games really took the series in a new direction and improved upon the older games in many ways. Out of the 3 Alpha games, 2 is definitely my favourite, and this Gold/Dash iteration is the definitive one, and for the Saturn is exclusive to this compilation. Another 5 out of 5 game, no question, so 2 perfect scores mean a no-brainer that this compilation does get a 5 out of 5 from me. Whether this actually helped the Saturn's library of games is questionable, though. Vanilla Street Fighter Alpha 2 had already been out on the Saturn for a long time before this eventual release, and it would have been available for much cheaper by the time that was on the shop shelves. Whilst it was awesome to finally have an arcade-perfect version of Super Street Fighter 2 Turbo at home, many gamers would have played Street Fighter 2 Turbo, Special Championship Edition, or the original Super Street Fighter 2 to death on their SNES and Mega Drive, so this may have felt less than essential to them at the time. Let's give this 1 out of a possible 2 bonus points then. At the time, this collection was released on the original PlayStation, and though it's good, it's nowhere near as arcade perfect as this Saturn version, as is common with Capcom games of that generation. Back in the day, this would have been very easy to recommend, but of course nowadays we've just had the excellent 30th anniversary collection for PS4, Xbox One, Switch and PC, with literally arcade perfect conversions of 12 Street Fighter games, including Super, Super Turbo and Alpha 2. Sure, it's not the gold version of Alpha 2 included in this collection, but honestly the differences are minimal, and this 12-game collection is infinitely better value and has much more variety, including interesting historical games like the original Street Fighter 1 and vanilla Street Fighter 2, and excellent games like Street Fighter Alpha 3 and Street Fighter 3 Third Strike. With a compilation like that available on so many systems nowadays, there is literally no reason to spend such silly money on this Saturn release unless you are a die-hard Saturn or Capcom collector like I am. Also, if you're more interested in the Alpha series than the original Street Fighter 2, bear in mind that you can get Alpha 2 as a cheaper standalone game, or even Alpha 3 on Japanese import only, so yeah, no bonus point. As for foreign versions, you may be starting to see a pattern here. Have a guess. The American version of this game is pretty expensive, around the same price as the European one, but the Japanese version is super cheap. Usually around £15 to £20, but I have seen it as cheap as just £3 or £4. If you absolutely have to play Super Street Fighter 2 Turbo on your Saturn, go for that Japanese version, obviously. No bonus point. As for games that succeed or improve upon it, well, it's arguable that Super Turbo and Alpha 2 are absolute peak versions of their genre, though many would argue that Alpha 3 and Street Fighter 3 are contenders too, of course. As I've already said though, regardless of your taste in these things, the new 30th Anniversary Collection makes this older collection unnecessary. Heck, if Super Turbo is your game of choice, Arcade 1UP are now selling an awesome-looking replica 3/4-sized arcade machine in Walmart for not much more than this game will actually cost you. So, no bonus point. So yet again, a 5 out of 5 game, completely scuppered by its high price and better versions being available elsewhere. Just one bonus point gives it a 6 out of 10. Excellent, excellent games, but this collection is hideously overpriced nowadays, so just buy them elsewhere.
4.
Now, this game is near legendary. If you're a fan of shmups and you haven't played Radiant Silvergun, you are doing yourself a major, major disservice. Tragically, this game was only ever released in Japan, hence the little CD case here, because this is how they came in Japan. And back in the late 90s, this was one of the main reasons that people started modding their Saturns and importing games. A copy of this one will unfortunately now cost you an arm and a leg. If your arm and a leg cost between £110 and £190, that is. This is a vertically scrolling shmup in the bullet hell subgenre, but even if you don't generally like the bullet hell style, you should play this one anyway. It's the very definition of a masterpiece. The only thing I should need to tell you is that it's from the geniuses at Treasure. Literally every Treasure game is worth playing, and this, of course, is no exception. The graphics are a unique mix of 2D and 3D, and everything moves at a lightning-fast pace with so much happening at once that it is a real treat for your eyes. The weapon system is unique, and the level and boss designs are exemplary. This is another STV title, so it is literally 100% arcade perfect. I literally have nothing bad to say about this game. It is perfect. 5 out of 5. Let's move on. Is it a good game addition to the Saturn library? Of course it is. Shmup fans consider this like a holy grail, one of the best games of all time. The fact that this never got released on the Saturn in any territory other than Japan is one of the great injustices of the century. There are loads of great shooters on Saturn, but this is in a class of its own. 2 out of 2 bonus points here. At the time, this was a system exclusive. Whilst it's amazing for 3D, the PlayStation simply couldn't handle all the textures and sprites needed to do the arcade game justice, and Treasure stated they would never even attempt to port it to the system. However, nowadays you can play an excellent port as a download-only title for Xbox 360 and Xbox One. And what with Ikaruga coming to Steam as well, it's likely Silvergun will follow, and PS4 and Switch have both been teased to possibly get ports in the near future. Whilst it is amazing to see just how this game pushes every last drop of power out of the Saturn, considering its high price tag, it's hard to recommend the Saturn version over one of the newer ports, so sadly no bonus point here. Of course, there are no other regional Saturn versions, so just this Japanese one, and it gets this bonus point by default. Well played, I guess. Of course, Ikaruga is the semi-sequel to this game, and it's equally excellent. That game is available on Dreamcast, GameCube, and recently Steam for PC at the bargain price of just a tenner. However, that doesn't negate the need to buy or play Radiant Silvergun. They're both pretty different experiences and excellent in their own way. In fact, whilst I love both of the games, I actually slightly prefer Silvergun, so yeah, bonus point here too. So, another 5 out of 5 game, getting a decent amount of bonus points as well, giving us 9 out of 10 for Radiant Silvergun on the Saturn. It is an excellent, exemplary game which everyone should play, but if you have access to a modern system that can play it, you'll save yourself a ton of cash by buying it there instead. Honestly, I don't care where you play it, just play this game!
3.
Deep Fear is a survival horror game set in an underwater naval research facility. Developed by AM7 at Sega themselves, in another life this could have started a new Sega franchise, but sadly that wasn't to be. It was actually the last ever game released for the Saturn when the system was all but dead, and therefore it was manufactured in pretty small numbers. Complete box copy like this will set you back $140 to a pretty crazy £250 depending on the condition. On the one hand, this game is a complete shameless rip-off of Resident Evil, taking the graphic style, camera angles, tank controls, first aid sprays dependent on type, and even the over-the-top soap opera style voice acting. It does, however, add some unique elements, mostly the underwater setting, the ability to use certain items while still moving, and a kind of tension-building mechanic where you slowly run out of oxygen. It's quite atmospheric, and the storyline is okay, but to be honest, this pales in comparison to any of the early Resident Evil, Silent Hill, or Dino Crisis games. I'm going to be harsh and give it a 3 out of 5. Whilst it isn't a great game, it's not a bad one by any standards, and for the Saturn's library is actually a welcome change. The Saturn got a great version of the original Resident Evil, but sadly Sony persuaded Capcom to keep the second and third game and the whole Dino Crisis series away from Sega's 32-bit system. The games would eventually come to Dreamcast, of course, but as far as the Saturn's library, there's really only Alone in the Dark 2 and The Crow City of Angels to compete with this game, and this game is easily better than both of those. So if you only owned a Saturn and completed the first Resident Evil and wanted more, this really was your best option. It's also an interesting historical point as the last European game and a failed Sega franchise. I'll award it 2 out of 2 bonus points for that. So this is a system exclusive, so an easy bonus point again. Perhaps, unsurprisingly, it was never ported to any other system, but I do think there was actually a lot of untapped potential here. If Sega had made a Dreamcast sequel and improved upon the format, it could have been a good series. It's a shame, really. Deep Fear was never released in America at all due to the Saturn dying in that territory even quicker than it had in Europe.
How can we sleep at night when there's so much suffering in the world?
Well, come on, Lisa, ride the Homer horsey. Giddy up, whee!
The Japanese version is cheap at only £8 to £10, but what is surprising is that while you'd think it would be unplayable for non-Japanese speakers, for some reason they included full English dialogue and mostly English menus, meaning that it's pretty easy to play the Japanese version even if you don't speak Japanese. So if you're curious to play the game at all, I'd highly recommend this cheap import rather than the extortionate PAL version. No bonus point for the PAL version, but a really handy tip there. Of course, there were no sequels or improved modern ports, etc., but with the same genre, you'd be far better off playing pretty much any mainline Resident Evil, Silent Hill, or Dino Crisis game. If the underwater theme appeals to you, I would highly recommend Resident Evil Revelations on 3DS, Wii U, or as part of the recent collection on modern consoles and PC. It's really pretty great and like a modern return to the old style of games, and I'd actually recommend the first one over the sequel. So this is a very rare game, but only averagely playable at a solid but unspectacular 3 out of 5. 3 bonus points though for exclusivity and historical collectors' interest bring it up to 6 out of 10, so it's worth it for die-hard collectors, but not so much for if you just want to play a survival horror game.
2.
Known as Rockman in Japan, Capcom's Mega Man is hopefully another series that really needs no introduction. Whilst some may know that there were a ton of numbered Mega Man games, with number 11 released just very recently, many casual observers wrongly assumed that Mega Man X was just the 10th game. The X series is actually a spin-off franchise which took the established formula of the 8-bit series and expanded upon them for 16-bit SNES and the 32-bit consoles. Both the standard Mega Man and Mega Man X series continued to run concurrently. Of course, Mega Man X3 is the third game in the X series, and this European Saturn port is extremely expensive, costing anywhere from £170 to £260 to add this to your PAL collection. It's pretty hard to take this game on its own merits, considering how many other Mega Man and Mega Man X games there are.
It's a game, dude. It's really fun. You son of a... You were supposed to get me the red Mega Man! Now I can't make Ultra Mega Man! You dirty cheap-ass piece of crap!
just taking it as a hard-as-nails action platformer with some interesting mechanics and ideas. It's a really nice game. It's not quite perfect, there are some strange design choices in some of the levels, and though it's nice to play as the new controllable character Zero, the way they're implemented leaves a lot to be desired here. I'm leaning towards 4 out of 5 for this one. It's great to have a good-looking, nice-playing traditional 2D sprite-based platformer on the Saturn. There are plenty of other good 2D platformers on Saturn, like Sonic Jam, Earthworm Jim 2, Rayman, Super Tempo, Astral, and also Megaman 8 and X4, although the latter two only came out in Japan. There's also some great 2.5D stuff like the Clockwork Knight and Bug series of games, Pandemonium and The Lost World. Yes, I like that game, fight me. You get to control a T-Rex and eat people, for God's sake. There's even at least one decent 3D platform game in Croc. But out of all of them, the Mega Man series is still unique, and considering this is the only title to come out in Europe, and also was bringing a series many felt was a Nintendo property to a Sega console, I think it deserves a full 2 bonus points. And yes, I know there were Mega Man games for the Mega Drive and the Game Gear, but they're quite rare, they were hardly advertised, and people still mostly associated Mega Man and Mega Man X with Nintendo systems at the time, so it was kind of a coup. Mega Man X3 is available on the SNES, though obviously that version is simpler than the 32-bit versions and is pretty rare and expensive in itself. It came out on the original PlayStation and DOS PC, though complete box copies of both of these are expensive as well, commanding at least £100 each. Out of all the retro releases, the Saturn version is arguably the best. However, of course, we've recently gotten the Mega Man X collection of games for modern consoles and PCs. And for the first half of the collection, you can get X1 through 4 for just £20, so that's a steal at that price, so go for it. I can't award a bonus point for the Saturn here. Mega Man X3 was again never released on the Saturn in America. As you'd expect, the Japanese game is much more common and far cheaper at around £20. There's no language barrier here, just run, jump and blast away. If you really want to play on the Saturn, go for the Japanese release. Just remember to search for Rockman instead, obviously. No extra point. Of course, there's a whole ton of Mega Man and Mega Man X games, and it is a mixed bag. Whilst X3 is not the worst by any stretch of the imagination, that dubious honour probably goes to X7, Mega Man X1, 2 and 4 are all noticeably superior games to 3, as are Vanilla Mega Man 2 and 3. So play all of those games first. Though, honestly, if you own a modern console, just buy the recent Mega Man collections and you'll get basically all the Mega Man games that you need for far less than the price of this one game. So I can't award a bonus point here. Right, so 4 out of 5 on its own merits, but the fact that you can get far better Mega Man games for far, far less money elsewhere really lets this one down, with only 2 bonus points giving us a total of 6 out of 10. Honestly, it's a really fun game, but this version is overpriced and for hardcore collectors only. On the plus side, the PAL box art is really nice. It's cropped from the Japanese version, but it's enlarged and it looks really, really cool. Of course, this is actually a pretty big deal, as the Rockman games have a history of truly awful Western comedy covers. Number 1 is probably the most notorious of all the valuable Saturn games, Panzer Dragoon Saga. This game is very well known for being an exclusive title for the system that came out right at the end of the console's life, with very few copies made or sold. The price tag on this one is staggering, with copies fetching at least £275 incomplete, and often upwards of £400 in complete condition. The game comes on 4 CDs in 2 plastic cases, and the thing to look out for is this cardboard sleeve that holds them together. If you have all 4 discs, the manual, and this sleeve in good condition, this is easily £350 to £400 right here. So, is it a good game? Oh yes.
Oh yes.
The Panzer Dragoon series is legendary for the Saturn, with both the original and the sequel Zwei being excellent and surprisingly deep rail shooters with fantastic graphics, music and atmosphere. But this third game in the series is a huge, sprawling RPG that took everything great about the first 2 games and turned it up to 11. Not only is this my favourite RPG on the Saturn, it's even my favourite RPG of all time. In my opinion, it's even better than Final Fantasy VII, Chrono Trigger, Suikoden, Phantasy Star, Grandia, Super Mario RPG, all of which are incredible 10 out of 10 games in their own rights, and I love them, but honestly for me, this game beats them all. It's just so unique. This was the game that finally made my PlayStation-owning Final Fantasy fan friends want to get a Saturn as well, just so they could play it. The graphics, music, story, and incredibly unique battle system are all astounding. Obviously, it gets the full 2 points here. This game was a Saturn exclusive, it was never released on any other system, and sadly very unlikely to ever be remade, remastered, or re-released, as the source code somehow got lost. Someone at Sega should have been fired for that, no question. Sadly, therefore, the only way to play this game is to fork out the cash. Now, you can save yourself a little money by buying the first of the 4 discs loose. This was given away on the official European Sega Saturn magazine, and it can be bought for around just £10, so you can experience the game yourself for cheap, but I will warn you, once you complete that first disc, you will be maxing out your credit card to buy this full version. I've no problem awarding the extra point for uniqueness here. In other regions, the American version is just as rare, if not more so, commanding $400 to $600. The Japanese version of the game is called Azel or Azul Panzer Dragoon RPG, and it is much, much more common and cheaper, around £40 to £80, but of course, as an RPG, it is very text-heavy and useless unless you are fluent in Japanese. It really won't be any use to you. Note, for this game, this is the version to buy, despite the price tag. 1 extra point awarded. Finally, are there any sequels or better games in the series? Sadly not. I truly wish there were. Panzer Dragoon Auto on the original Xbox is an excellent game that I would highly recommend, but it's a rail shooter like the first 2 Saturn games. For the full immersive RPG experience, this is truly the best way to experience the world of Panzer Dragoon. An extra point here too. So, there you go. As a standalone game, this obviously gets a full 5 out of 5. But as to whether it's worth the money, yeah, it gets a full 5 out of 5 as well, which gives Panzer Dragoon Saga a full 10 out of 10 recommendation from me. Although it is crazy expensive, if you're a fan of the Saturn or Japanese RPGs in general, it is worth seeking this one out, even with the exorbitant price tag. If you don't care about the cardboard sleeve, you can find the game like this for around half the price. And if you just want to try it out, don't forget you can pick up the first disc loose for about a tenner. So that rounds out our list of 14 Saturn games, and if they're worth the cost. As I said, these aren't the only pricey games on the system. I've already got another 14 planned out for a future episode, including the most expensive Saturn game of all time, valued at over £1,000. Spoilers, I don't actually have that one, but we'll come to why in the episode. But it's not all bank-breaking costs for wannabe Saturn collectors. I'll also cover the complete opposite end of the spectrum, with 14 incredible PAL Saturn titles available for under a £5 each. So be sure to subscribe and follow on Twitter to not miss out on those. But for now, it's time for me to awkwardly end this episode because I honestly don't have any satisfactory way to end this. Thank you so much to all who support our channel, and please consider helping our charity appeal either with a small donation or by sharing it with others. Also, if you fancy buying me a coffee, why not join our super awesome Patreons? Links to both are in the description. Massive thanks to Richard Carter, aka Fantastic Dizzy, The Savage Gaming Show, and everyone else on screen right now. I love you! I've been Samuel Victor. Thank you for having me, and I hope to see you again next time.
Please like and subscribe and follow us on Twitter. Thank you for watching.
The American version of this game commands the same kind of prices as the European version. Shut up, dickheads outside. Are there any sequels? Do we even really need to ask? There are a ton of different versions of King of the Fighters. Fucking dickheads outside.